How we got here is a long and twisted tale. Hold on to your hat. Remember John Dee? He was the Kabbalist innovator in the courts of England's Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, who is credited with founding Freemasonry, or at least organizing it along occult lines. Kabbalah, by the way, is an esoteric system of interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures based on the dubious idea that every word, letter, and number and accent mark has a hidden occult meaning, with which, presumably, you can make the Tanakh mean anything you want it to. Invented by Jewish mystics with way too much time in their hands, it surfaced somewhere between the 7th and 11th centuries, promising religious enlightenment to the elite cognoscenti, the initiates into its mysteries. It enjoyed an enthusiastic following among pagan-leaning Jews and later among so-called Christian ecstatics until the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, which is hilariously ironic since Lucifer's, the wannabe light-bearers, fingerprints are all over it. Kabbalah was an important ingredient in the writings of Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati. Not surprisingly, it's making a comeback in these last days. A Google search will turn up hundreds of thousands of references on the web. Since it's authored by the father of confusion, it not only defies precise description, it apparently can't even be spelled. I counted at least 8 different spellings for words that are pronounced Kabbalah. Anyway, one of these machinations was the proposition that the British were the descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. I know it sounds stupid, but he had really good political reasons for promulgating this theory. The Jews had been expelled from Britain in 1290, as they would be from Spain in 1492, but in the turbulent wake of England's split from the Roman Catholic Church, precipitated because Henry presumed he needed a divorce from his first wife Catherine if he were to father a male heir, it was considered prudent to forge a political alliance with the Jewish bankers of Amsterdam, who had grown rich and powerful as international moneylenders, and who, not incidentally, bore no love for the Roman Catholic Church. The concept of British Israel was thus forged to suggest a common racial identity. This paved the way for the eventual return, in 1664, of the Jews to England. It also created the erroneous basis for British imperialism, the idea that they, as the rightful heirs of Abraham, were destined to rule the earth. Man, if I had a nickel for every time someone stole something or killed someone because of a twisted interpretation of Yahweh's scriptures, man, I'd be a wealthy guy. Fast forward to 1689. The last of the Catholic-leaning Stuart kings is replaced on the throne by one William of Orange, formerly William Stradholder, Captain General of the Dutch forces, who had, through the machinations of the Jewish moneylenders in Holland, married Mary, Princess of York, setting him up as the future English king. 5 years after his coronation, William repaid his benefactors for their influence, and in the process plunged England, and eventually the whole world, into the cesspool of financial Babylon. In 1694, you see, he persuaded the British Treasury to borrow £1,250,000 from the Jewish banking houses of Amsterdam. National debt, as we know it today, was born. The amount was horrendous, but the terms were even worse. The lenders' names were to be kept secret. They were given a charter to establish a central bank, the Bank of England. This bank's creditors were then given the right to establish the gold standard for paper currency. At this point, the fox was in the henhouse. Further, the bankers were allowed to lend out £10 worth of paper currency for every pound they held in gold, in effect creating money out of thin air. Alarmed yet? It gets worse. The national debt they had created, and this is the real innovation here, was to be paid for by the direct taxation of the English people, both the principal and the interest on the unpaid balance. Of course, then as now, it was never intended that the principal would ever be paid off. Rather, the bankers would continue to pull money out of the ether and lend it to the government at interest. In 4 short years, England's national debt increased almost 13-fold to £16 million. The foxes now owned the chickens and their children's children's children. Way to go, William. I hope you enjoyed being king. Perhaps you've gotten so comfortable with the idea of national debt that none of this bothers you. But it should, for Yahweh himself considers the whole scheme an abomination. See Revelation 17:5. Perhaps you think it's somebody else's problem. Wrong again. It's your problem if you're a taxpayer or depend on one. I don't care what country you live in. If you pay income taxes, a large proportion of those taxes goes to pay for interest on loans, money your government has borrowed. And why have your leaders borrowed this money? To pay for wars, social programs, crime fighting, things that more often than not the powers behind the governments have engineered in order to induce them to borrow money to deal with them. You may protest, well, what about infrastructure, roads and such? What about space exploration? What about protecting the environment? Yes, all of these things and more are properly within the purview of government budgets, but none of them have ever required borrowing a penny. If there are beneficiaries, the cost should be borne by them. If there are villains that negatively impact expenses, they too should bear their proper share. That's why we have, for example, gasoline taxes for road users, fines for industrial polluters, and tolls for bridge passage. We have no business using taxpayers' dollars to send space probes to distant planets searching for signs of life. Signs the scientists desperately hope to find so they can prop up their sagging evolutionary presuppositions. Communication satellites, on the other hand, should be paid for by the people who benefit from the service they provide. Am I implying that we should all stage a tax revolt? No, it's far too late for that. William of Orange cooked our goose way back in 1694, and we've been reheating the poor thing ever since. 1913 was a particularly auspicious year, with the passage of the American Federal Reserve Act and the national income tax, something so contrary to our Founding Fathers' ideals it took a constitutional amendment to perpetrate it. Andrew Jackson is still rolling over in his grave about that one. Back in Chapter 14, Mystery Babylon, I recommended reading G. Edward Griffith's The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve. I mention it again here because if we don't understand how currency, wealth, and central banks work, we will never comprehend the evil octopus of financial Babylon as presented in prophetic scripture. National debt in the modern, that's the post-1694 sense, is a stealthy and nefarious form of slavery. We are all familiar with the term debtor nations, a description used of those poor small countries who come to the rich industrial ones, hat in hand, looking for a loan or a handout. It's an erroneous concept. All nations are debtors, even, or should I say especially, the largest and most prosperous. The United States, as I write these words, has a legally mandated debt ceiling of $7.4 trillion. We're not just in a financial hole, folks. This is the journey to the center of the earth. So how do developing nations borrow money from wealthy ones? They don't. To understand why, we need to comprehend how money is created. In the real world, building wealth is the natural result of industry, of applying work and insight to the solution of problems and the meeting of needs. That explains why Israel, for example, with very little in the way of natural resources, is so much more prosperous than any of its oil-soaked Islamic neighbors. But that's only the real world. The world of international finance is something else again. The money that's loaned to developing or third world nations is created in parallel with the debt it represents, not by wealthier nations, but by banks. It is nothing but ones and zeros in a computer somewhere. There is absolutely nothing of real value backing it up. Scary, huh? Today, all industrialized nations operate their own Bank of England-style central banks. In the U.S., it's the Federal Reserve Bank. In Germany, it's the Deutsche Bundesbank, and so forth. They are, in effect, banking monopolies with sweeping powers that were created by legislative acts of their respective nations. They are allowed to issue currency far in excess of any actual assets they hold. The Federal Reserve Bank, for example, has no silver at all, and all the gold held in the Federal Reserve System and at Fort Knox covers no more than 10% of the outstanding paper currency. Our money, therefore, has no substantive basis of value. It is created by fiat, by the policy not of the government, but of the central bank. But wait, you say, these central banks are owned by their respective national governments, aren't they? No, sorry, they're not. They're corporations owned by individuals and other corporations, not by governments. Worse, they all have interlocking directorships, joint stock ownership, cross-ownership, and substantial cross-loans. The directorates and majority shareholders of these institutions comprise an incestuous list indeed. The same family names pop up over and over again. Rockefeller, Morgan, Lazard, Warburg, Schiff, and, of course, Rothschild, the who's who of the Illuminati. Their interests lie in protecting each other, not in looking out for the welfare of their host governments, and certainly not the citizens of those nations. People in these industrialized countries are there for only one purpose: to pay the bills. There's more to
all the nations that have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornication.
Than the industrialized world, of course. The developing nations don't have their own central banks. Does that prevent them from selling their souls to the devil, as we have? Not anymore. Today they have the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which, in slightly different ways, serve as conduits for international bankers, read Illuminati, to create new money in parallel with new debt. The World Bank, holding only nominal reserves contributed by its quote-quote wealthy member nations, draws up bonds on behalf of the debtor nation, which are then sold to commercial banks. In purchasing these bonds, money is created by these banks. The IMF presents itself as a financial pool of money quotas contributed by its subscribing nations, most of the world. But only a quarter of the quotas are payable in gold, the rest being created in parallel with debt. Again, credit is being manufactured out of thin air and wishful thinking, with but a fraction of the new money backed by anything resembling real assets. Actually, it has been even worse since 1979, when the IMF instituted what are known as special drawing rights, which serve for all practical purposes as a new form of international currency, aka New World Order funny money. Did you happen to pick up on the real game the international banking community is playing? With wealth being conjured up from nothing in parallel with the debt of its victims, client nations, they are risking little or nothing since no real assets are changing hands. Yet interest payments, in real money this time, must still be paid. And paying down the principal? Well, who's got anything left over for that? In theory, debt principal that is paid off cancels the artificial creation of wealth that was accomplished through the original loan. But the loans are never really expected to be retired. That's the whole point. The interest is supposed to pile up forever, making the international bankers ever richer in the process. Although there's no consensus about the number, the total world debt today seems to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 trillion. If you work out the compound interest for the next 20 or 30 years, the picture becomes truly frightening, or slapstick silly, depending on your scriptural point of view.